Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope everyone is well. And thanks for joining the restarting of the Automotive for the New Normal. Just to check, can everybody hear us at this present moment in time? If you can, just use the chat box on the side. Yes, from Jack, Peter, Ed. Awesome. Everyone can hear us. That's super. Look, thank you very much, guys, for joining this afternoon from the UK. So restarting Automotive for the New Normal. My name is Helen Neal, and I'm going to host the session for you this afternoon. We've got a great list of panelists joining today just to talk you through really how they see from their perspective how we need to restart the automotive industry and how we need to get it going given the current COVID crisis, both in terms of the short term and also what needs to happen in the course of the next coming months and potentially years ahead. So without further ado, I want to just hand over to a couple of our guests. We've got James Stevens from Aston Martin. James, do you want to just say a quick hello to everyone?
Hi everyone, I'm James Stevens, Director of Government and Corporate Affairs at Aston Martin Lagonda.
Thanks, James. Next, we've got Matin from Bosch. Emma, would you like to just say a quick hi?
Yes, hi Helen, Emma Martin, Head of Political Affairs from Bosch.
Thank you, Emma. And we've also got Mike Haig-Martin from from Autocraft. Mike, do you want to just say a quick hi?
Yes, hello everybody. Yes, Mike Haig-Morgan. I'm co-owner of Autocraft. For those of you that don't know us, we're Europe's largest engine remanufacturer and low volume builder, based here in the UK, around about 250 employees under normal economic circumstances.
Thanks, Mike. And Mike's joining us over the phone today, so it's good to hear your voice, Mike. And lastly, we've got Matt Weston MP, who is joining us. We've just got a couple of technical difficulties, so we're going to bring Matt in shortly. Matt, I will introduce him whilst he is trying to join us. Matt Weston MP is also the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for electric vehicles as well, and he joins us today. So really our aim today was to get the whole ecosystem together so that we could have an informed debate about how we see the automotive industry moving forward in the UK. So I'm keen to kind of kick off, and I would say that during the course of the session, we've got a couple of polls that we will be sending out and that you're welcome to join and to comment on as we go through the session. And then towards the end of the session, any comments, any questions that you have, we will do our very best to pick those up at the end and pose those questions to the audience, to the panelists, so that we can inform you a little bit better towards the end. So without further ado, we're going to kick off and really start with, I guess, the most prevalent thing happening at the moment, which is that kind of get back to work slogan that we've heard, and how we get back to work within the automotive industry and what we do around things to do with PPE and social distancing, particularly when it comes to manufacturing. So Eman, actually I'd like to start with you, because unusually for some of the industry, you guys at Bosch have been operating throughout this current crisis. So why is that, and how have you managed to cope in this difficult time, and perhaps there's some lessons that can be learned from your experience already? We've just lost Emma briefly. Hopefully she'll come back in. But James, I think from Aston Martin's point of view, how do you see things heading in terms of get back to work slogan, and how is Aston Martin preparing for this?
It's been difficult for all manufacturing companies and all companies in general. I think we were one of the last car OEMs to close our manufacturing facilities at the end of March. And I think from that point onwards, we were looking at how we could restart. Obviously, we've been working with limited guidance from Public Health England, Public Health Wales, etc., for our Welsh facility, health and safety executive guidance. And we've built our own guidance to allow us to start operations down in our South Wales facility last week. So we're now in week 2 of limited operations, and I say limited, we're at about 40% workforce capacity at the moment as we get back to a semblance of normality at that facility. Obviously, working with the staff, we're working with the unions to ensure that the safety of staff is right at the core of all of our back to work guidelines has been the most important facet. And I think, as the government guidelines published only yesterday, we are in the middle of reviewing how our own guidelines reflect theirs. So there aren't too many differences, thankfully, and we'll adjust and adapt our guidelines as the government guidelines change. I think the subtle nuance for us is the differences between Wales and England, and many of our staff traverse the border. So hopefully we don't have too many issues with Welsh police stopping English people going to work in Wales and vice versa.
Mm. Emma, you've come back. Just a question from your perspective. What have you learned? Oh, because obviously you guys have been in operation for some time. You never really stopped in certain aspects during the crisis. So what lessons have you guys learned from Bosch that you might be able to share with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize about dropping off, and I hope I will not drop off again. But anyway, so one of the lessons is really how, when the government reach out to help and support in BBE supply, Worcester Bosch repurposed the production line to produce ventilators. And that is really bring us to the discussion which we should have in this crisis, is how could we again make things in this country. PPE is definitely one of these aspects of it.
Yeah, Mike, from your perspective as an SME, I presume this is going to be much more challenging, perhaps some of the larger OEM and manufacturers and tier one suppliers like Bosch. How are you guys coping, and what's the SME sector doing to prepare for this next phase of managing coronavirus?
I think you're absolutely right. We've as a sector, we don't have the deep pockets, and we don't have as much resource around us to make changes and throw people and money at this problem. So we're having to be quite imaginative. We've been very reliant as a sector on government support, and the fact that CJRS has worked so well is a very pleasant surprise. And I think we're all the first to criticise government for their computer systems and paperwork not working, but on this occasion it's been a remarkable success so far, and I've seen some tweets today that's going to be extended, so that's very welcome. There are other financial support which hasn't been so great by the banks. The supply chain is needed to get C bills and CL bills up and running, and the capacity in the banks has seen some real problems for others. I mean, we're fortunate that we're one of the strong ones as an SME, privately owned SME, but it's clearly affecting the rest of the supply base. I chair the automotive components section for the SMMT, and I'm therefore aware that we've got a number of members that are really feeling it within the SME community.
I think we've got Matt Weston back on the line. Matt, are you there?
I'm here. I hope you can hear me. You may not be able to see me.
We can hear you now. We can't see you, unfortunately. Matt, I guess just a perspective from you in terms of government guidelines on PPE, and really what and how the automotive industry should be or can be managing that in terms of that return back to work. Your view and your perspective on that.
Helen, sure. Firstly, thanks to all those in the sector who, stood up and tried or sought to help the health service. Many of you in not just in the front line, but OEMs made themselves available, saying we can actually produce PPE as needed. And I thought it was a terrific response from the automotive industry. So real credit to the sector. I think there are some challenges here, personally, in terms of what was said at the weekend and then yesterday. My personal view is that that responsible businesses will obviously be wanting to work with employees to ensure that the guidelines, the social distancing guidelines, are adhered to. And of course, in manufacturing, that's quite hard. So wherever possible, that PPE should be used to ensure that our employees, they are our most valuable asset, are protected. Now, I think beyond what the needs are for the NHS and for social care and so on, there are many businesses out there desperately wanting to supply health workers and so on who cannot get contracts But I would have thought there's an opportunity for those sectors to better supply into our manufacturing as well.
Great, thank you. And moving slightly on, obviously with going back to work with the PPE, but also other measures that are happening with around the job retention scheme, particularly I think from the perspective of OEMs and also the SME sector. James, Mike, starting with you, James, do you have any view in terms of the job retention scheme and what should be done about that? Should that be extended? How long should that go on for? Do you guys have a view on that?
Well, yes, indeed. And I'm delighted to see that only this afternoon the Chancellor extend the job retention scheme out to October, which is brilliant and provides companies up and down the country in all sectors with some sort of semblance of certainty. I think the extension out to the end of July on the terms that it's currently implemented on is very welcome. That allows us to plan for the short term, and obviously we watch and wait to see what the terms are going to be from August through to the end of October, with an assumption that that's going to, the 80% contribution from government will reduce and we'll have to pick up the balance, which is fine. And we were as a company topping up to 100% for the first 5 weeks of the JRS anyway. I think it's been very welcome. I think we've seen a lot of potential large manufacturing companies put the hand up and say there's likely to be redundancies, and I think providing some semblance of certainty to companies in the manufacturing sector is very welcome, whilst we have a near zero demand side pull for product. Obviously we can make cars, and as I said, we've started making cars in South Wales, but if no one's going to dealerships to buy them, then the dealerships physically can't pay the salaries, and therefore there's going to be very, very little demand for those cars being manufactured. So we're very happy to see that extension.
Yeah, we've just run a poll with the audience, and the audience is telling us, I think by far and away the single biggest concern I think to the UK car industry at the moment is the lack of demand that you just mentioned, James, and people not buying cars. So we've got around 5% of you said that social distancing on manufacturing was the biggest concern and threat. Around 23% of you said that it was actually the over-reliance on the supply chain, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But actually 72% have said that it's actually the fact that people aren't buying cars and that lack of demand, and that's one of the topics we're gonna come on to very shortly. But for the moment, in terms of supply chains specifically, we've seen in recent times this perhaps an over-reliance on a global supply chain, and when you have crises like COVID, it really brings that into focus. What challenges have all of you had around the supply chain for your operations? Emma, I'd be interested to hear from Bosch as a major supplier to the car manufacturing industry. How have you managed?
Absolutely. I'm sure you can't see me, but hopefully you can hear me. So we are dealing with a global crisis, really starting from last year with China lockdown, creating an impasse to get components from our plants in Asia. And that has really led us to look into alternative sourcing strategies in that perspective. And it became apparent how integrated the automotive supply chain is, but how vulnerable we are in dealing with such crises. So when we look into what can be done, we need to think about it from the short-term measures to the medium, long-term measures. And short-term, I just would like to, first of all, thank the government for the GRS scheme, which is really helpful and supportive to avoid the cliff edge. But I also want to point out in a model used in Germany and also France with the short working condition, allowing, if you like, people to go part-time and integrate quickly. And maybe this is something we should consider. In the medium and long term, we need really to look into the supply chain. How could we develop resilience and competitiveness? And in that perspective, if I see China, for example, as a practice or best practice, each time they have a crisis, they start to create a huge infrastructure project to stimulate the market. So at the moment, currently, they are working on a huge 5G infrastructure project to create businesses, if you like. So that would take us back to how could we reshape the industrial strategy to then create this resilience, as I said. And maybe this is a question to Matt.
I think it's absolutely a great question to Matt. Matt, in terms of the industrial strategy and how we go forth, you know, post-COVID, is the industrial strategy fit for purpose now, do you think?
I think there's work to be done on the industrial strategy. Clearly, one of the huge priorities for the automotive sector is the transition, really, in motive power sense. So maybe a massive investment, I think, from government on that front, and some direction as quickly as possible would help, I think, because in times of uncertainty, you look around and you need some clarity from policymakers, and I think that would be a key thing. I think that also one of the most important things is, and you know, I'm reminded of what happened around 2008, 2009, and the establishment of the Automotive Council. And I think one of the great things that could be done now is to look at the industrial strategy, but also the supply chain, and see what sort of bodies are needed to be established to ensure that we have that resilience, really, in the UK, but certainly very close by. Because as has been demonstrated in the last 6-7 weeks, but also those of us who've been in the industry or around the industry for many years, we can recall instances where, in the aftermath of Fukushima or the floods in Bangkok, and just the massive impact those events had on the whole automotive sector. So I would like to think this is a huge opportunity for all of us, but and I'm sure the government will want to take a lead on this.
Yeah, thank you. Mike, from an SME perspective, on just thinking about industrial strategy and how that might be adapted and changed going forward, what would you particularly like to see, given the fact that we're in this effectively what is a new normal?
I think the point that Matt just made about the Automotive Council is really important. I think we as SMEs want to understand what's needed in 10 years from now. We need to put a plan together to understand how to migrate to that, which technologies are more likely the ones that are needed, therefore the UK should support and back, and which will not be a priority during this huge period of change across the UK. I think that's one important part of it. But as an industrial strategy, I know that we've been talking with government as an automotive sector where the UK leads on remanufacturing. The circular economy is something which I think this has really proven that for a robust supply chain, you need other weaponry in your armory, and how a proper circular economy with more remanufacturing content can be more robust. I mean, Autograph's a great example of that. We produce new engines, 100% new parts. We also produce remanufactured engines. So when we can't get parts, we're reclaiming engines, parts for engines. So we've been far more resilient through this period than other companies. We've actually been able to keep supply going much higher than we ever were anticipated by reclaiming parts that previously went in the bin. So I think the industrial strategy needs to be a bit tuned and bring forward some of the circular economy elements that we've been pushing for some time.
Thank you. James, just from Aston Martin's perspective, I think something that your organisation has pushed for a long time is building up the UK supply chain base. So do you see this as almost a bit of an opportunity now for that to happen? And if so, what would need to be done to achieve that?
I think it's an opportunity, but I think, you know, to be realistic, we're never going to have a supply chain that can provide us 100% of our components. The market economics are such that things would be just too expensive to do in the UK. However, that doesn't mean that we can't look, as Mike and Matt have both said, at what is needed in the future and invest in the new technology. working with tier ones that are already here and incentivizing tier ones, tier twos, tier threes, etc., to come to the UK where there's a strategic need for them. But I think what as Eman said right at the beginning, what the COVID-19 crisis has shone a light on is that we are an integrated global industry. We are reliant upon, but if not tier one, tier two, or even commodities from around the world, and therefore we need to have an idea of what's going on the ground. And spending a lot of my time talking to embassies and consulates around the world to ensure that we can get that magic component line side. Otherwise, we'd have to stop production. Fortunately, so far we've managed to do that, but it's come close a couple of times.
Yeah, just taking on the point earlier about the issue around demand and supply at the moment, and how that's probably going to cause some challenges for the industry in the upcoming months and potentially next couple of years. What could be improved to support the potential erratic demand and liquidity problems that we might end up facing over the coming months ahead? What sort of measures do you think would be helpful to be put in place? Matt, I'd be interested to hear from you on that one.
Well, I have long been a fan of fiscal stimulus, really, to see us through difficult periods and just flatten out the bumps in the road, for want of a better term. I commend the government for introducing the C-bill scheme for smaller businesses, the SME sector, with its bounce back program. That's a good initiative, and that's what we as opposition were calling for. Clearly, we need to keep businesses afloat. We need to keep the supply chains connected, and I think stimulating the economy through supporting wages is the most important thing. I think there was data in the last 24 hours that showed a drop of 40% in consumption across the board in the last month. I mean, it's a massive when you think about it. And of course, we're still consuming food, still paying for electricity and all those sorts of other things. But basically, a lot of consumption has just fallen off the cliff. And we saw the decline in vehicle sales of 97% last month, which is serious. Enabling people or encouraging people to purchase and giving them some degree of security in buying that. And that's where the furlough extension, as James was just talking about, to the end of October, and some flexibility, I hope, will be introduced earlier than August, because I think that's needed, I think is really important. People need certainty in their lives. There's a lot of anxiety out there, and we won't get consumption on big ticket items until there is more certainty. So I think that's a key thing that the government needs to send out. And whether they can do that through fiscal stimulus of assistance, enabling purchase of certain product, I think that would be a very welcome thing. So that's where my priorities would lie.
Mm. Well, it sounds, Matt, that actually your priorities are very much in line with our audiences. We just put out a poll shortly a few moments ago in terms of what measures should be introduced to restart the UK market, and 53% of the audience tell us that actually the introduction of financial incentives for new cars is probably the most important one. Behind that, at 34%, we've got build up the UK supply chain to reduce the global reliance, and then a much smaller portion, 13%, to continue the job retention scheme for as long as needed. So it's clear, I think, from the audience and from what you're saying, that this need to kickstart a new financial incentive program to support purchase of new car buying is probably one of the most critical. I'm interested to bring in Eman on this point, because obviously being Bosch and being a German company, and we've seen what Germany is currently proposing to introduce there on an incentive scheme. It'd be great to get your perspective on that, Eman. What could we learn from Germany, and what might be able to be transposed from what they're proposing over into the UK?
So Germany is indeed implementing the scrappy scheme and trying to stimulate with that the consumer demand. They're looking also to encourage availability of bank credits. However, the current crisis has caused many consumers to cut back on consumption and increase savings, especially where we do not have enough safety net, if you like, in the current environment. So maybe this measure will not work or questionable to work. There is another way, which is probably good for debate, is to decrease massively the VIT and empower with that the buying power and increase the sales. So I'm not sure if my colleagues agree with me, but maybe this is a measure to see moving forward to implement.
Yeah. And James, from Aston Martin's perspective, how would you see a system being set up for purchasing of new vehicles? You know, from your perspective, I mean, do we need to replicate what we saw back in 2008, or should it be different this time?
I think we're in a different time, and we need to look at the macroeconomic picture for the UK. Clearly, there's only so much money going around, and whilst we want to try and stimulate demand today, we need to think about tomorrow as well. So clearly, that will be a priority for the Treasury. I think a scrappage scheme as we had in 2009, which was 50% funded by the industry, that would be challenging. The industry is really on its knees, so jointly funding a scheme would be challenging. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it would be very challenging. I think Eman's talked about a VAT reduction. That might be a simple way of doing something. It could be a short-term measure to reduce VAT on the purchase of new vehicles across the board. We need to stimulate demand, not in just the car sector, but the trucks and buses sector as well. And that may be a fairly easy thing to just wind VAT down to perhaps 15% from its 20%. The German grant scheme, I think that would be a nice idea, but I think it would be very challenging economically to do that. But I don't work in the Treasury, so I'm sure their magicians will find a way.
Yeah, Mike, you come in, I guess, from a slightly sorry,
Helen. I was going to just come in on what James is saying and so on, and I'm sure for Aston Martin, looking at what's happening in China and how their economy has rebounded. I mean, it's really taken off since the relaxation of the restrictions there, and I think the consumption, they've seen a big boom in it in the last few weeks. And of course, for companies like Aston Martin, for Jaguar Land Rover, and so many of our major automotive brands, we want to be in those markets as quickly as possible, because that will then help drive our own economy as well and our recovery. That was all.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And actually, Simon on the chat actually says, do you think government would actually want to incentivize internal combustion engines, given where we're at? I guess that's a slightly controversial question to ask, but Matt, from your perspective, and I know you're chair of the APPG on EV, do you have a view on that?
I want to ensure that we incentivize a managed transition, and that's a difficult thing. It's like, think of the UK PLC as an organization, and you're wanting to switch from one thing to another. You've got to do it in a very gradual way. You don't want seismic change. So I think having a system of incentives that encourage consumers into products that are right for them right now is really important. But yes, we do need to drive towards electric vehicles for many categories as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Helen, if I could just quickly come back on Matt's point, I completely agree with his point about EVs. But if you're looking at the demand side response in places like China, our dealership network is largely open now in China, but we're seeing 20% of normal footfall through the door. So whilst the dealerships are open and the economic recovery is starting to happen, we're still seeing an 80% reduction in footfall, and people don't buy Aston Martins online. They don't buy Ford Focuses online. People want to see the car, they want to touch it, feel it, smell it. So it's a long way to go. We're not out of the woods yet.
Yeah.
I want to comment,
please,
Helen, if possible, also on the ICE question as well. I think I agree with Matt, absolutely. I think the challenge now is that you have OEMs who they actually invested heavily in, developing and as well as supporting the uptake of EVs. And on the other hand, you could see also due to this crisis that the oil prices plumbed down to be actually even cheaper than a chewing gum. So means is that the consumers will actually think twice of any switch to any technologies in the current or even medium future. And this is something maybe we need to consider also on the recovery plan as well. How could we incentivize in a positive way the switch to different technologies, but as well as how could we look maybe on alternative fuel, synthetic fuel, which is probably a topic for a different roundtable.
Yeah, so it needs to be something that's looked at in the round rather than being too specific. And I guess at this present moment in time, the fact that we are indeed in a crisis, we need to look at stimulating the whole market, as I think James and Matt said earlier. Mike, I just want to bring you in from the supply chain perspective. We've talked a lot about the demand stimulation side, and obviously there will be, if that happens, that's a good knock-on benefit for yourselves, but specifically for SMEs, which is part of the lifeblood of the UK economy. How do you see financial and fiscal incentives supporting SMEs specifically, and where can OEMs perhaps support you in that space?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a much rockier road than most people realise. I think the realisation is starting to come through that we need to be a lot more flexible, which is why JRS needs to be not 3 weeks. I mean, we could bring back another 20 or 30 people tomorrow if I knew I could just bring them back for a week. And that isn't just now, that's going to continue until the end of the year, possibly until we get a vaccine. So I think we need to be learning to live with this in a far more flexible way. In particular, as an SME, we're all about flexibility, and therefore, in its current form, JRS needs to change. From a funding perspective, I think we are in need of banks being more flexible, but also on how banks are measured, because since the financial crisis, there is a lot more auditing of banks. Yes, there needed to be a lot more regulation, but I think the time it's taken to introduce C-bills for people to actually get money demonstrates the lack of flexibility. And for an SME, you really need a lot more certainty over answers, a lot faster than the current system is set up to do.
Yeah. And I think that flexibility point is important, both in terms of the financial support, but one of the other points I wanted to bring up to the group is around the regulatory flexibility support as well going forward. Even before COVID, with Brexit, this was an issue for the automotive sector. But just in terms of regulation, what could be done now that would be some simple ways in which to support the industry in this difficult time from a regulatory perspective? And I want to start with you, James, actually from an OEM from that point of view.
We need to be realistic. There are a number of regs coming at the industry this year, as there are every year. And I could reel off and bore people with details, but we need to be realistic about the ability for car companies, big and small, to meet those. I think the biggest one that does impact everybody is the end of series provision. So a car made to the standard this year essentially has to be sold or registered before the end of August. We certainly have many cars in dealers which we won't simply sell before that time. So if they're not registered, they're essentially obsolete and would be scrap. Seems rather ironic, but if you pre-register a car, it is inherently second-hand, and therefore the value diminishes. So the majority of the industry, from the smallest manufacturers all the way up to the big boys, will be pushing DFT for an end of series derogation. And indeed, this is a European reg, so again the EU. So that's specifically one specific example. But I think we need to take a flexible approach to regulation in the round to allow companies to get back to some semblance of normality. And that's not a cop out or seeking a backdoor to not be compliant. That's not it at all. I think we just can't meet the regulations where we have existing stock. Yeah.
Matt, just want to bring you in on this point from a regulatory point of view. There are some levers, aren't there, that can be pulled to help support the industry going forward at this time?
Yes, it's just listening to James there, just making some notes on it. It's something that that I would be very, very keen to support for that to be extended. And I'm sure through the all-party parliamentary motor group that we can do that and write collectively cross-party to secure that. And I'm sure Europe will be wanting to do that. All the manufacturers across Europe will be wanting to extend that, and as you say, have a derogation. Yeah, it's not an area that I'm so au fait with, but I think the last 2 months and the seismic impact it's had on the industry and on so many categories, but of course the automotive industry is probably one, particularly in the UK, which faces so many challenges, whether it be the transition we were talking about before, but also with Brexit facing us too, that I think degrees of flexibility I think would be very useful. But to go back to my point that I think there's an opportunity to really face up some of the big challenges, get some of these older vehicles off the road is really important. People are commenting about just how much better the air quality is presently. We should get some of these very old diesel vans and lorries and stuff off the road. Get the cleaner vehicles on, whether they be petrol, diesel, or alternative fuel. Get them on. And so those sorts of regulations, I think we should be pressing on, and perhaps being a little bit lighter elsewhere.
Yeah. And Eman, from Bosch, do you see any specific regulatory flexibility that would help from your perspective as a major supplier to the auto sector that could support things in the current time?
I think, this automotive industry is really resilient and proved to do so. I mean, we are in this challenging environment and uncertainty for more than 2 years. Probably a relief of regulation to be achieved towards the end of the year will help the companies, especially some OEMs are suffering from cash flow collapse. So means is probably a delay would be beneficial. However, I think it's much complicated as we think, as some of the regulatory requirements is on European level, and that will be determined from other countries to agree moving forward.
Yeah. And lastly, Mike, from your side, is there any specific regulatory elements that you see that could be beneficial, particularly to the SME community in this short-term and difficult period?
Not specifically about any rules or regulation changes. I'd just like to add that we've seen a significant increase in demand over the last couple of months as people can't buy new vehicles to replace engines in quite old diesel engines, Euro 4, Euro 5. We should be trying to get people to switch to newer Euro 6B. We have an issue in that industry and the public doesn't perceive the very latest diesels as being as clean as they really are. So any scrappage scheme is going to take quite a bit of a Marcom's budget to really get that across to the public, because it's at the moment I don't think the general public understand the difference between the very latest diesels and the previous generation diesel. And until we can get that across, any scrappage scheme or incentives are going to be difficult to sell.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very good point. I want to start to bring this discussion over to the audience now and give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions on the chat section. We've had a few questions come in already. We've got one here from David, who says, what will drive economic growth in the UK if there is an enduring deficit in demand for services because of social distancing? Short-term incentives will not address potential long-term paradigm shifts in the economy. Is the answer to prioritise creating and manufacturing new products, a new economic strategy that aims to re-industrialise? There's quite a big topic, David, that we probably don't have time for on this session, but just picking out a few points, I guess, looking at that longer term strategy, perhaps going back to what that new industrial strategy might need to look like, or indeed a revamped industrial strategy. James, do you have some views in terms of what that might need to look like for the automotive sector in the UK, not just in the next kind of 12 months, but looking well beyond 3, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, I think, David, it's a very good question, and I think the UK government's current industrial strategy looks to incentivise and looks to help manage that paradigm shift from traditional internal combustion engine powertrains through to hydrogen powered and battery electric. I think the challenge we've got at the moment is, do you incentivise one or the other? At the moment, most companies make their money through the sale of, as Mike and Matt was saying, Euro 6 compliant petrol and diesel vehicles. That revenue then provides them with a small profit. Automotive doesn't make huge revenues, and then they can plough that money back into the research and development for that next technology. If we skip over the current advances that the automotive sector have made in internal combustion and just fixate solely on the zero emission technology space, then we risk losing lots of businesses in the UK. We'll stimulate demand and we'll stimulate new businesses in the future, but the employment rates at the moment, we need to maintain and protect the jobs and the people that are employed today, and help manage, as Matt said earlier on, that transition from internal combustion through to the new paradigm, rather than just saying we'll bin the existing sector and we'll move to the next.
Great. Thank you.
If I may, I think there is an opportunity for some short-term wins here. Reshoring has definitely been highlighted as required. We were talking about it as potential Brexit planning, but actually the supply chain fragility that we've seen means there are reshoring opportunities. And if there is stimulus to be thrown within the supply chain, now is a very good time to do that and reshore some of that product this year, because we still don't know what will happen come the 31st, a deal or no deal in terms of the trade. So it's an opportunity if we're going to spend money on something to try and stimulate the supply base, I believe.
Great, thank you. Also, as well, we had another question in about just going back to the incentivization and the purchasing of new vehicles. Has there been any indication from government, or perhaps from your party, Matt, in terms of how we might look to stimulate the auto sector at this stage?
Well, I haven't picked up anything specifically from government, but I, perhaps others have. But there are so many things going on, as you'll appreciate. It's pretty difficult to keep on top of all the issues. Certainly, we were saying before the election about incentivizing transition, putting in place a fiscal program to encourage movement in a managed way. And that's the important thing for the whole industry, is that we do manage any shift to different powertrains over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I think there's a fantastic opportunity for everyone in the sector to make that happen, certainly to pressurize the government. I think the industry is actually in a relatively strong position, because the economy needs the automotive industry. It's really, and it showed its adaptability, its flexibility, really, as I was saying at the outset about applying itself to PPE and so on. I think that the supply chains that we have, it's important that the industry speaks as one voice about the future resilience of the sector, and how important it is. Putting schemes in place, incentive schemes to encourage the shift, as Mike was saying, to cleaner diesel and so on, I think is really important. And I would like to think we're not going to see the investment in EV charging points in the next 5 years. It's not going to happen on the scale that perhaps it should have done. I think maybe putting the government under pressure, saying rather than spending all this money on certain other projects, let's think about just shoring up and making sure that this sector that's been so hugely successful the last decade continues.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions in. So the first one is from Alan. who says the UK auto industry and its tier suppliers have shown their ability to repurpose their skills and assets to support ventilator and other medical items. The push for supply companies based in the UK to diversify in other sectors should continue alongside auto supply to take up availability capacity. I'm going to just hand that one to Eman, because I know Bosch have done a sterling job in terms of diversifying some of your operations to support the COVID effort. Do you have a view on that in terms of that diversification, Eman?
Absolutely. I mean, we really shown how flexible we are and how agile in that perspective. We weren't hesitating for a minute to repurpose the production for whatever helped the country to get out of this COVID crisis. So you're absolutely right. How could we actually, in this circumstances of lack of demand, repurpose some of our capacity to maybe produce other products? And I will encourage this to be a part of reshaping the industrial strategy moving forward.
Yeah,
Thank you.
If I may, we're a traditional business being on for 40 years. We've got elements of our business, very standard traditional manufacturing processes that are not so easy to adapt to different products, different markets. But we were early adopters of digital, and we've got digital assembly processes that are very flexible. I think from an industrial strategy perspective, this has been a great example for anybody that's been able to adopt digital already in their manufacturing processes. That's where they've been more reactive and be able to pick up opportunities in other markets. So I think that's one area the government really, it needs to take its Made Smarter initiative and make that a lot faster. They need to roll it out faster.
Thank you. David says, if demand, sorry, Eman, did you want to come in?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. David says, if demand is reduced at home, but still relatively strong elsewhere, is there anything we can do or should do to help drive the UK auto exports? James, I know this is a topic perhaps close to your heart, particularly for Aston Martin, where you've got a big export base. Have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I think obviously we're a global exporter, and I think we as a company and our subsector of sort of the luxury space, we're somewhat different to the rest of the auto sector, which is very focused on the continent of Europe. Obviously, Europe is, including the UK, is about 40 to 45% of our volume, with the UK a good 50% of that. So we are looking beyond the continent of Europe a lot. I think when we're looking at the demand from the supply base, the point that possibly we're trying to get at here is, as I said earlier, we want to repatriate more of our supply chain. We want to bring it back to the UK. We want to make a more British product. I'd like to say because we're patriots, but it's practical realities. Post-Brexit, we're going to need to look at the rules of origin. We're going to need to be compliant. And therefore, we need to make sure that the components that go into our car are more British than they are today. And Aston Martin, we're probably one of the most British car companies that exist. So there is a huge challenge for car companies. But, turning around to a company like Nissan or Toyota and saying you need to now look at exporting your product to the US, that's sort of contrary to their current business model. We'd need to sort of pose that question to them. Honda was the only Japanese transplant that did export to the US, and they're closing. So I think with the advent of the Japan-EU trade deal, Japanese manufacturers are less inclined to look at setting up factories to supply the US, specifically when they have factories in Japan that can do that.
Just
Thanks.
if I may, Helen, to comment shortly on the question. I totally agree with James. I think you have only one chance to get supplier or supply in the UK in looking into a totally new products roadmap, and that means hydrogen, for example, could be potentially an opportunity for the UK to lead on that, and also to build up the supplier chain as we are in the start of the product development, if you like.
Thanks, Eman. We've got a question from Robert who says, does the panel believe there exists a real threat to the international tier one organisations could, due to spare global capacity, relocate and consolidate facilities in mainland Europe, leaving the UK potentially vulnerable ahead of EU exit in January 2021. So I guess this is all about how these, we've got a great base of foreign automotive manufacturers here in the UK. Could this, I guess, be another element for tier one suppliers to potentially move from the UK and go elsewhere? Eman, I guess back to you on that, as a major tier one supplier and being of German base, have you got a view in terms of that and how you think tier ones might behave?
Well, it's a very good question. We cannot end without mentioning the B word. So here we go. I think, from my opinion, as Bosch, we are committed to the UK market. So from that perspective, we are looking to the government to hopefully have an FTA in place and allow us still to have a good exchange with our neighbors in a good manners as well, not to disadvantage the export of products elsewhere. We are looking in ways of actually looking at like I said before, sourcing strategies where you think that some components would be beneficial to produce in some regions and some not. So for example, if we are nearer to our automotive manufacturers, so some of the products may be beneficial to still produce in the UK. It's a hard question because we don't know how the shape would be of the FTA, and therefore we all hope that the FTA would be in place before end of the year.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, I'm conscious of time. We've just got a few more minutes before we're due to close. So I wanted to just sum up and also give the results of our final poll as well. I think, firstly, massive thank you to all of the panelists for joining and giving such a great perspective on a wide range of areas within the auto sector. I hope it's been informative for the audience as well. Thank you to the audience for participating, for some really great challenging questions and also taking part in the polls as well. I think it's clear from the session today that whilst that kind of initial get back to work and perhaps managing of social distancing and PPE might be an initial challenge, we are a very innovative industry and we're very good at getting over these slight obstacles and hurdles. I think what is more of a challenge for the industry from what we've discussed is some of the aspects around the demand-led side and how we manage that demand for car purchases and getting the auto industry back up and running, and how those policy measures can perhaps look to stimulate, perhaps not replicating what we had back in 2008, but a newer version to kind of reflect today's reality. Perhaps some more flexibility, both in terms of financial flexibility, especially for the SME side, and regulatory flexibility, perhaps more for the likes of the OEMs as well. And really to say that all of us, I think from this session, it's clear that you're telling us that it's about 43%, in fact it is 43%, think that this challenging environment for the auto sector is going to last between 2 to 3 years. Around 20% of you think that it will last between 1 and 2 years. 26% think it's probably going to be more than 3 years. And we've only got 11% who feel extremely pessimistic and think that it's never going to go back to how it was. So I think, looking at it, we're looking at a sort of 2 to 3 year timeline in terms of managing these initial challenges and helping the industry get back up and running. So thank you very much to everyone, the panelists and you, the audience, for taking part. Hope you have found this informative and it's been useful, and we look forward to hosting another session in due course to see how far we've progressed on some of these topics in the coming months ahead. So thank you very much for joining, and wish you a rest of a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.